How did they sleep through -40 degrees Celsius nights without blankets? Imagine the wind howling across a frozen steppe, the sky a bruised violet, and a small group of people huddled around a dim ember, trying to keep their bodies from turning into ice blocks. The first thing you have to understand is that prehistoric humans didn't rely on a single thick blanket. They built a whole system of insulation, heat retention, and clever positioning that turned their bodies into living heat traps. First, the shelter itself was a critical component. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of semi-subterranean pit houses and mammoth bone frames covered with layers of sod, bark, and animal hides. By digging a shallow depression, often 30 to 50 centimeters below ground level, they took advantage of the Earth's relatively stable temperature, which can be several degrees warmer than the surface even in deep winter. The walls were then packed with compacted snow or packed earth, which acted as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. Inside, they arranged their sleeping platform on top of a thick mat of dried grasses, moss, or split birch bark. These plant layers provided a dry, insulated barrier between the cold ground and the body. On top of that, they layered animal skins, reindeer, bear, or bison hides, often stitched together with sinew to create a makeshift quilt. The skins were not just any skins, they were the inner fur side, which is densely packed and retains heat far better than the outer, hair-covered side. But the real secret was body heat management. People would sleep side by side, sometimes even in a sleeping ring, with the fire pit at the center. This arrangement let each person's radiated heat warm the shared air, while the fire's residual warmth, still glowing embers in a pit or a stone hearth, kept the microclimate above freezing. Experiments at the University of Bristol have shown that a group of 6 adults sleeping around a low-intensity fire can maintain a core temperature above 36 degrees Celsius even when the ambient air is -30 degrees Celsius. When fire wasn't an option, say, during a storm that blew the flames out, people turned to thermal sleeping bags made from fur-lined skins that they could wrap tightly around themselves, much like a modern mummy wrap. The fur's air pockets trap heat, and the tight wrap minimizes convection losses. Some sites, like the 30,000-year-old Dolní Věstonice settlement in the Czech Republic, show evidence of pillow stones, smooth river stones that were heated in the fire and then placed under the back or between the legs to act as portable heat sources throughout the night. Nutrition also played a role. High-fat diets, think marrow, blubber, and dried meat, provided the caloric fire needed to keep the metabolism humming. A higher metabolic rate generates more internal heat, which, combined with the insulation strategies, meant that even in a -40-degree gale the body could stay warm enough to avoid hypothermia. Finally, cultural practices helped. Many groups performed a night watch, where 1 or 2 members would stay near the fire, ready to rekindle any dying embers. This not only kept the fire alive, but also created a sense of communal responsibility, reducing stress, another factor that can influence how the body regulates temperature. So, no, they didn't have fluffy blankets or electric heaters. They built insulated pits, layered skins, huddled together, used residual fire heat, and ate calorie-dense foods. All a perfect, low-tech solution that allowed them to drift off under a sky that could drop to -40 without turning into an icicle. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep their toes from turning into icicles when the wind was screaming at -40 degrees Celsius? The answer isn't magic. It's a clever combination of animal skins, snow-filled sleeping pits, and the simple physics of sharing body heat. First, let's talk about the outer layer. When a mammoth or a bison fell, early hunters didn't just eat the meat, they salvaged every hide. Archaeologists have found thousands of perforated stone needles and split-leaf awls in sites like Kostenki and Dolní Věstonice, evidence that people were expertly tanning skins long before the invention of metal tools. The tanning process was a slow soak in animal fat, brain-derived emulsifiers, and ash water, which turned raw hides into flexible, water-repellent blankets. Once stretched over a frame of wooden ribs or simply wrapped around the torso, these skins acted like a natural down jacket, trapping a layer of still air close to the skin and shedding moisture that would otherwise chill the wearer. But a good coat only gets you so far when you're lying on frozen ground. That's where the snow bed comes in. Excavations at the Grotte du Renne in France reveal shallow depressions carved into packed snow, sometimes lined with pine bark or moss. The snow itself is an excellent insulator because it is mostly air trapped between crystals. By digging a pit a foot deep, then covering it with a layer of animal skins and a few branches. A sleeper created a microenvironment that stayed several degrees warmer than the ambient air. Experiments with replica pits show that body heat can raise the temperature inside the trench by up to 5 degrees Celsius, enough to prevent frostbite on exposed limbs. And when the night grew truly bitter, they didn't hunker down alone. Ethnographic studies of modern Inuit and Siberian peoples show that group huddling can cut heat loss by up to 50%. Skeletal remains from the Altai Mountains display a pattern of healed rib fractures consistent with sleeping side by side in cramped spaces, suggesting that groups would curl together, backs pressed against one another, heads tucked under the shared canopy of skins. The combined effect of shared warmth, reduced surface area exposed to the wind, and the insulating layers of fur and snow meant that a small band could survive a night that would otherwise freeze a solitary individual solid. So the hidden insulation trick was not a single invention, but a layered strategy. Tanned animal skins for wearable warmth, snow-filled sleeping pits to keep the ground from stealing heat, and cooperative huddles to turn a few bodies into a single, living furnace. That's how Ice Age people turned the harshest cold into a survivable night. No high-tech gear required, just ingenuity, cooperation, and a deep respect for the resources the wild offered. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep their bellies full when the world turned into a frozen desert? It sounds like a scene out of a science fiction movie, but the evidence is right there in the bones, the teeth, and even in the tiny pollen grains trapped in ancient hearth ash. Let's step into a typical day for an Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherer and follow the trail of food from the tip of a mammoth's tusk to a handful of frozen berries. First, the big game hunters set out before sunrise, when the air is still crisp enough to keep their breath visible. Their primary protein source was megafauna, mammoth, woolly rhino, bison, and reindeer. Cut marks on dozens of mammoth femurs recovered from sites like Dalny Vestonis show systematic butchering, skin removed, muscle strips sliced, and the thick layer of subcutaneous fat scraped off. That fat was the real gold. In temperatures that could plunge to -40 degrees Celsius, a single kilogram of mammoth fat could supply enough calories to keep a small group alive for several days. Modern experiments with similar animal fat confirm that it burns at a slower rate than muscle, providing a steady release of energy and, crucially, insulation for the body's core. But the hunters didn't rely on meat alone. Archaeologists have found stone tools with wear patterns consistent with plant processing, and residue analysis on flint scrapers from the Goyet Caves in Belgium reveals starch grains from tubers such as wild carrots and the roots of marsh sedges. These underground stores were especially valuable in the short Arctic summer when the ground thawed just enough to expose them. They could be dried in the fire and rehydrated later, giving a portable source of carbohydrates. When the season turned even colder, the menu shifted toward what the landscape could still offer: frozen berries, pine nuts, and the occasional seal or fish from ice-covered rivers. At sites along the Baltic coast, researchers have uncovered tiny fragments of dried cranberries and lingonberries, preserved in permafrost. Isotope analysis of human bone collagen from those same sites shows a noticeable spike in plant-derived carbon during the brief thaw, suggesting that even a handful of sugary berries made a big difference in maintaining blood glucose levels. Fish and marine mammals were another crucial supplement, especially for groups living near the sea. At the famous Kostenki 14 site, cut marks on salmon vertebrae indicate that Upper Paleolithic people used bone needles to gut the fish quickly before the icy water could spoil it. They would smoke the flesh over low embers, a technique that creates a protective layer of fat and reduces moisture, allowing the fish to last weeks in cold storage. And let's not forget the surprise ingredient that many modern people would never guess: bone marrow. When a hunter cracked open a mammoth rib, the creamy marrow inside was scooped out and eaten raw or lightly warmed. Bone marrow is dense in calories, about 7 kilocalories per gram, making it an efficient energy bar in a world where every bite counts. All of these food sources were carefully managed. Charcoal layers in caves show repeated fire pits, indicating that people cooked, dried, and sometimes even stored meat in pits lined with stones and covered with earth, early refrigeration, if you will. In some sites, like the Potocani Cave in Croatia, researchers have found stone slabs with shallow depressions that were likely used to press and dry meat, turning it into jerky that could survive the harsh winter months. So, when we picture the Ice Age as a barren wasteland, we have to remember that it was also a landscape full of hidden calories, fatty megafauna, nutrient-rich tubers, resilient berries, and fish caught from icy streams. The diet was a mosaic, each piece fitting into a strategy of high energy intake, rapid preservation, and clever use of whatever the frozen desert would surrender. It wasn't a monotonous meat-only menu. It was a sophisticated, seasonally tuned buffet that kept our ancestors alive in a world where a single missed hunt could mean the difference between life and death. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep a fire going when a gust of -30 degrees Celsius wind could snuff it out in seconds? The answer lies in a surprisingly sophisticated chemistry lesson taught by a handful of tiny quartz shards and a lot of patience. Scientists believe that the first reliable fire-making tools were made from flint or chert, hard, microcrystalline silica that fractures with a sharp, glassy edge. When a piece of flint is struck against a piece of iron-rich pyrite or a carbon-rich firestone like marcasite, the impact shatters microscopic layers of the mineral, generating temperatures of up to 3,000 degrees Celsius at the point of contact. Those brief, blistering flashes ignite the fine tinder that early humans carefully prepared: dry grass, birch bark, shredded cattail leaves, or the fluffy inner fibers of pine needles. Archaeological sites across Europe, from the Kostenki shelters in Russia to the Lascaux caves in France, contain traces of burned ochre and charred plant material that match this method. Experiments by experimental archaeologists confirm that a single well-placed strike can produce a spark that, when caught in a nest of tinder, will flare within half a second. But the real trick was not the spark. It was the hearth design that turned a fleeting ember into a lasting blaze. Ice Age peoples dug shallow depressions in the ground, often lining them with stones to reflect heat and protect the flame from drafts. They added a base layer of dry bark, then a thicker mat of larger twigs, and finally a fuel cake of split wood, usually spruce or pine, because those conifers burn hot and evenly. The initial spark would ignite the bark, and the careful layering allowed the fire to grow gradually, reducing the chance of a sudden flare-up that could scorch the shelter or draw a predator's attention. To keep the fire alive through long, cold nights, they used a technique called fire maintenance. Small, pre-charred pieces of wood, essentially prehistoric fire starter logs, were kept in a separate compartment of the hearth. When the main flame dimmed, a piece would be dropped in, reigniting the core without the need for a fresh spark. This practice is evident in the repeated presence of charcoal fragments with a uniform size distribution, suggesting deliberate preparation rather than random burning. But fire was also a communal resource, and the knowledge of how to start it didn't belong to a single individual. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups, such as the San of the Kalahari, show that fire-making skills are taught through observation and hands-on apprenticeship, often involving the whole band. In Ice Age sites, where patterns on flint tools, microscopic striations and pitting indicate repeated striking, implying that many members of a group possess the skill. This redundancy meant that if a storm blew out the hearth, another member could quickly revive it, preventing a night spent shivering in the dark. Finally, preserving fire through the winter required clever storage. Researchers have uncovered stone fire pits that were partially covered with earth or animal hides, creating insulated chambers that retained heat for many hours. By covering the ember with a thin layer of dry moss, the heat stayed trapped while still allowing enough oxygen for a slow, steady burn. When morning arrived, the embers could be fanned back to life with a few new sticks, saving the energy and time of striking flint again. So the next time you hear a crackling campfire, remember that behind each spark lies a millennia-old science of stone, tinder, and careful hearthcraft, an invisible, yet vital technology that kept Ice Age humans warm, fed, and safe from the biting cold of a world that was, literally, on fire. How did our Ice Age ancestors stop a wound from bleeding out when a mammoth spear slipped, or soothe a burn after a flint misfire, or even keep frostbite from stealing a finger? The answer isn't a fancy kit, but a handful of hardy plants, clever bandaging tricks, and a deep understanding of the body that was honed over thousands of years of trial and error. When a hunter returned with a deep gash, say a thigh laceration from a broken spear, first aid began with pressure. Archaeologists have found stone pads and smooth river stones at many Upper Paleolithic sites, and wear analysis suggests they were used as makeshift compresses. The injured would press the stone directly on the wound, while a companion wrapped the limb with strips of bark or woven grass. The bark acted like a primitive gauze. It's absorbent, flexible, and, crucially, contains tannins that help clot blood. In colder climates, the pressure was often applied while the victim lay on a snow-covered hide, using the cold to constrict blood vessels and slow bleeding, an early version of what we now call cold compression. Burns were a different nightmare. Early humans sparked fire with flint and pyrite, and a misstep could singe skin in an instant. The first line of defense was the ubiquitous fireweed, Chamaeneurion angustifolium, known to Paleolithic peoples from pollen records in cave sediments. The plant's leaves are thick, moist, and contain salicylate compounds, natural precursors of aspirin. Survivors would crush the leaves into a paste, spread it over the burn, and then cover it with a layer of soft moss or fern frond, creating a cool, moist dressing that reduced inflammation and protected the wound from infection. Charcoal fragments, found in hearth layers, were also ground into a fine powder and sprinkled on burns. The carbon's adsorptive properties helped draw out toxins. Frostbite presented perhaps the most brutal challenge. In a blizzard, a finger could go from pink to black in minutes. The first response was to get the victim into a sheltered microenvironment, most often a shallow pit lined with animal skins or a cave alcove warmed by a fire. Then the Ice Age hunter-gatherer would thaw the affected tissue slowly, using warm water from a meltstone or, more commonly, by holding the frozen limb against their own chest, where body heat could be transferred gradually without causing a rapid re-warming shock. While this was happening, they would apply a poultice made from the roots of the snow melt plant, Ranunculus glacialis. This alpine buttercup's root contains mild anticoagulants and soothing mucilage that mitigates swelling. The poultice was wrapped in a piece of deer hide, which acted as an insulating bandage, keeping the heat steady while the plant's compounds did their work. Even without modern antibiotics, these early treatments were surprisingly effective. Bioarchaeological studies of skeletal remains show lower rates of fatal infection in sites where such plant-based remedies were common. DNA analysis of ancient dental calculus has even recovered traces of antimicrobial compounds from willow bark and sage, confirming that our ancestors were not just lucky, they were practicing a sophisticated, evidence-based form of first aid using the natural pharmacy that surrounded them. How could a family of Homo sapiens or Neanderthals feel safe when a massive cave lion prowled the darkness just beyond their firelight? The answer lies in a mix of clever engineering, social coordination, and raw bravery that turned a rocky shelter into a fortified outpost. First, early humans chose caves with narrow entrances whenever possible. A tight throat-like opening could be blocked with a simple stone slab or a stack of large rocks, sometimes even a fallen boulder that had been nudged into place. Archaeologists have found dozens of sites where the entrance is partially sealed by massive lithic blocks, clearly moved by human hands rather than natural collapse. Inside, the layout was anything but random. Excavations at sites such as the Chauvet Pont d'Arc and the Kostenki Caves reveal organized living zones set back from the entrance, often on a raised platform of packed earth or stone. By keeping sleeping and food storage areas at least a few meters away from the opening, people reduced the chance that a predator could swipe a sleeping child or steal a cached carcass in a single lunge. Some groups even dug shallow ditches or dugouts in front of the entrance, filling them with sharpened sticks or broken bone spears, an early version of a deterrent fence. Nighttime was when the risk peaked, so fire played a dual role. The glow not only provided warmth and a place to cook, it also created a visible boundary that big cats tend to avoid. Radiant heat and the crackling sound of a fire signal that a human presence is active. A cave lion, which prefers silent ambush, will often retreat rather than face a bright, noisy opponent. Charred bones and ash layers in many cave deposits suggest that fires were kept burning continuously, sometimes fed by smoldering embers tucked into stone alcoves to avoid extinguishing in a gust. When a predator did manage to breach the outer barrier, humans responded with coordinated weaponry. Experimental archaeology shows that stone points hafted onto sturdy wooden shafts could deliver enough kinetic energy to wound a lion's forelimb or a wolf's throat. At sites like the Grotte des Pigeons in France, dozens of spear points have been found clustered near the entrance, their tips bent or broken in ways that indicate they were thrust into flesh and then retrieved. The pattern of impact scars on cave lion fossils from the same region matches the dimensions of these points, supporting the idea that early hunters used thrusting spears as a last-ditch defense. Social structure amplified these physical defenses. A typical band consisted of 15 to 30 individuals, with a clear division of labor. The strongest men often took the gatekeeper role, standing watch while the others tended the fire and prepared weapons. Children and elders stayed deeper inside, insulated by the platform and blankets made of animal skins. This arrangement reduced the number of vulnerable bodies exposed to a sudden attack. Moreover, vocal warnings, sharp whistles, or low guttural calls could travel across the cavern, alerting the whole group to an intruder before it reached the fire. Even after a successful repulse, early humans didn't simply forget the danger. They reinforced the entrance, added more stones, and sometimes even painted the surrounding walls with symbolic motifs. Some scholars argue these early, cave art pieces served a dual purpose: a ritual appeal for protection and a visual reminder of the ever-present threat. While the exact meaning remains debated, the timing of the paintings, often layered over earlier defensive modifications, suggests a psychological component to the overall strategy. So the ancient cave wasn't just a shelter, it was a carefully engineered stronghold. By choosing the right location, modifying the entrance, maintaining constant fire, arming themselves with stone spears, and organizing vigilant watch shifts, early humans turned the terrifying presence of cave lions and wolves into a manageable risk. Their success in fending off these apex predators gave them the stability to stay put, store food, and eventually develop the cultural complexity we now uncover in the dust of those very caves. How could a band of hunter-gatherers make it through a 30-year ice age when every day meant fighting frostbite, starving predators, and a constant threat of injury? The secret, as archaeologists and ethnographers keep pointing out, was not a fancy tool or a hidden cache of meat. It was the people who had lived the longest. The elders of a Paleolithic group were essentially living libraries, and their knowledge was the glue that held the whole tribe together. First, older members remembered the precise locations of the best shelter sites. Cave paintings and the distribution of lithic workshops show that certain rock overhangs were used repeatedly for centuries. Those spots were chosen because the wind funneled away the worst chills, the floor stayed dry, and the entrance could be blocked with stone piles, details that a youngster fresh from a recent winter could never discover on his own. When a new cold snap hit, the tribe would gather around the oldest woman or man, who could point out the exact spot where a layer of insulating pine needles had been left the previous season, creating a natural blanket that kept the ground from seeping cold into sleeping mats. Second, the elders held the culinary memory of the land. Microwear analysis on stone tools from sites like Dolny Vestanis shows a shift in diet during the last glacial maximum: more marrow extraction, more use of tuber-rich areas, and selective hunting of bison when the herd migrated south. Those choices didn't appear by accident. Oral tradition passed down through generations taught younger hunters which animal tracks indicated a healthy, less wounded bison, how to set up a drive lane that used a frozen river as a natural fence, and which season the wild turnip roots were still edible before frost turned them bitter. Without that stored information, a group could waste weeks chasing scarce prey and end up with nothing but thin skin. Third, and perhaps most dramatically, the oldest members provided the tribe's first line of medical care. Skeletal remains from sites such as the Shanidar Cave display healed fractures and even signs of early splint use, bones aligned and wrapped in bark fibers. Those splints were most likely applied by older individuals who had observed the healing process over many seasons. Experiments with replica tools show that a simple splint can reduce movement enough to let a broken rib knit back together, buying the injured hunter weeks of productive time. Moreover, ethnographic studies of modern foragers in Siberia reveal that elders know which lichens soothe burns, which mosses stop bleeding, and how to brew a weak tea from willow bark to ease fever. When a child developed a respiratory infection, the tribe's medicine man, often an elderly male with a deep knowledge of plant chemistry, would administer a decoction that, according to chemical analysis, contains salicylates similar to aspirin. Finally, the social role of elders helped keep the group cohesive. In a world where a single death could tip the balance between survival and extinction, the older adults acted as mediators, storytellers, and teachers. Their presence reduced conflict over food distribution. They could recall past instances when hoarding led to group loss, reinforcing the sharing ethic that modern anthropologists see as essential for egalitarian foraging societies. They also cared for the very young and infirm, freeing up the able-bodied hunters to focus on gathering. The extra labor saved by this division of labor, estimated at 15 to 20% of total daily energy expenditure, could be the difference between a successful winter and a famine. So, while the icy winds of the Pleistocene might have seemed unforgiving, the memory and care of the oldest tribe members turned that harsh environment into a place where knowledge, not just muscle, dictated who lived to see another spring. How could a newborn survive when the temperature outside the cave was minus 40 degrees Celsius, wind biting like a knife and predators prowling the snow? The answer lies in a combination of biology, ingenuity, and the social glue that held Ice Age groups together. First, the act of delivery itself was rarely a solo performance. Archaeologists have uncovered femur fragments with healed fractures in women's pelvises that match the stress patterns of repeated squatting births, suggesting that most deliveries happened in a low squat or semi-crouched position on a thick hide or woven mat. These mats, made from reindeer skin, mammoth hair, or woven grasses, provided a surprisingly warm, insulated platform. The mother's own body heat, amplified by the tight embrace of other women in the birthing group, created a microclimate that could stay several degrees above the ambient air. Immediately after birth, the infant was placed skin to skin with the mother, a practice known as kangaroo care that modern science shows dramatically reduces heat loss. In the Ice Age, the mother would wrap the baby in a fur-lined cradle, often using the soft undercoat of a wolf or the woolly underfur of a mammoth that had been stripped and cleaned. These layers trapped air, the best insulator, and could keep the baby's core temperature stable for hours. Breast milk was the only viable food source, and its high fat content, up to 55% in some hunter-gatherer populations, provided both calories and a natural antibiotic shield. Mothers who were lactating produced a thicker, more caloric milk, which helped infants gain weight quickly, an essential factor when the growing season was short. Protection from predators was a communal effort. Cave paintings and stone tools indicate that the whole band would rotate watches, keeping the fire lit and the entrance guarded while the mother rested. Small stone spear tips and bone needles found near hearths show that caregivers could quickly fashion makeshift barriers, like a low fence of sharpened sticks, around the sleeping area. Weaning did not happen at a set age. It was tied to seasonal resource abundance. When the first caribou herd returned in spring, adults began offering small, pre-chewed meat morsels to the toddler. This practice not only introduced protein, but also inoculated the child's gut with the same microbes the adults carried, building immunity. By the time the child was 3 or 4, they were competent enough to accompany hunters. But the bond forged in those first sub-zero months, through shared warmth, milk, and collective vigilance, remained the cornerstone of Ice Age survival.